The writer that followed Alan Moore was Rick Veitch. Veitch had written a few fill-in issues during the Moore run and had drawn most of the final Alan Moore arc. He was familiar with the character, so he seemed like a good choice to take over the series. More to the point, he was about the only person in the industry willing to follow the groundbreaking work done by Alan Moore. Veitch's run between issues 65 and 87 expand upon the consequences of Swamp Thing being ejected from Earth and wandering the galaxy. While the Swamp Thing was absent, the Parliament of Trees began the process of calling forth another Earth Elemental to replace him. Swamp Thing's return means there will be 2 Earth Elementals, and that's apparently against the rules. So, Swamp Thing is put in the position to either kill this replacement or find a solution that doesn't involve murder. Of course, Swamp Thing isn't good with murdering an infant version of himself, and that puts him at odds with the Parliament of Trees. The solution to the problem is very Veitch. Swamp Thing possesses John Constantine, uses his body to impregnate Abby, and then he places the baby elemental spirit into Abby's womb. Thus, Abby will eventually give birth to an Earth Elemental human hybrid. As it turns out, this was the end result the Parliament of Trees was looking for all along. It's a bit convoluted, and the logic is a bit shaky, but it's reasonably good nonetheless. As a transition from one writer to another, it's quite seamless. There's a huge tonal difference though. Veitch dips into the absurd and satirizes pop culture, as opposed to exposing the modern horror of existence. Veitch's run is also one continuous arc. Structurally, it's like a more traditional comic book. It reads like an ongoing title without an end, rather than a series of related stories with definitive conclusions that build to one final resolution. Unfortunately, the Veitch run came to a sudden, messy conclusion. Swamp Thing at this point was still a part of the regular DC universe, and, at that time, an event called Invasion was gearing up. For some reason, the invading aliens in that series used wood technology. This presented an immediate problem. With Swamp Thing's abilities, an invasion of that nature would begin and end in about 15 seconds. So Swamp Thing had to be taken out of play within the DC universe. Veitch's solution was to have the invading aliens disrupt Swamp Thing's aura and, well, look, it doesn't make much sense. One can definitely get what Veitch was going for though. It's a fantastical explanation, like one finds in Star Trek. Trek writers throw in a bunch of techno-babble to make the warp drive failing sound grounded in reality, when, really, it's just a bunch of nonsense words that don't actually mean anything. Well, that's basically what happens in Swamp Thing. A lot of esoteric, sciencey sounding things happen, and that plunges Swamp Thing back in time. From there, Swamp Thing encounters characters like Sergeant Rock, Enemy Ace, and Tomahawk as he falls backwards in time. During this arc, Veitch intended Swamp Thing to meet Jesus Christ, on the cross no less. Veitch submitted a detailed plot, then a full script for approval. Both were accepted, and the issue was completely penciled and partially inked before DC decided they were not going to publish the story. This sudden change of heart seems to be based on the negative reaction to the recent movie The Last Temptation of Christ. Due to this controversy, DC changed their mind about the story, so they pulled the issue and asked Veitch for something else. As one might expect, Veitch was displeased. He immediately quit the title. The writer that was supposed to follow Veitch once the time travel story concluded withdrew his story submission as a sign of solidarity. That writer was Neil Gaiman, who had just begun writing Sandman. The writer that had the unfortunate task of finishing Rick Veitch's time-traveling story was Doug Wheeler. Presumably, Wheeler had an outline to work from since much of what he wrote followed what Veitch intended to do. Still, for any writer, it can't be an easy task to take over a story that's mostly complete and then bring it to a satisfying conclusion. Doing so doesn't leave a lot of room to make your own mark, since one is trying to interpret the intentions of another writer. The end result was awkward and slightly confusing. At the end of the time-traveling journey, Swamp Thing creates the Parliament of Trees and then somehow manages to travel forward in time to the moment of the birth of his child, Tefe. Honestly, it's not clear how this was accomplished, and it may be reasonable to speculate that Wheeler didn't know either. Wheeler started off in a bad place, and he never really found his footing. He wrote the series from issues 88 to 109, which is a fairly significant run, but he didn't add anything to the series that was worthwhile. He did write The Birth of Tefe, but that was set up previously by Veitch. Following that, he had Swamp Thing return to Hell, yet again, to recover the soul of a loved one, yet again. Then he set up a war between the green elementals and the virus-like gray elementals, which was a story that felt a lot longer than it actually was. Overall, the stories were small. The comic steered away from horror and explored mostly straightforward conflicts. Swamp Thing was basically a god, but Wheeler never managed to come up with believable situations that challenged the character or exploited the vulnerabilities of the character. To be fair, Wheeler also had a team of artists that never really suited the series, the exception being Kelly Jones, who stepped in for one filler issue. So, unfortunately, for the few years Wheeler worked on the series, it looked and felt competent, but it wasn't overly interesting. The series began to shed readers during Doug Wheeler's run, and it was on the verge of being cancelled. Editorial decided the series needed a strong horror element to revive the comic book and prevent its cancellation. So, horror writers were approached and asked to pitch stories and a direction for the character. Editorial decided on Nancy A. Collins, an author best known for the novel Sunglasses After Dark. She officially took over Swamp Thing with the 6th annual and began a lengthy run on the title from issues 110 to 138. Collins immediately set the tone and location, making it obvious the series was going to explore grotesque horror and remain, for the most part, in the Louisiana area. She also incorporated the folklore of the area into the series, giving it a distinct Cajun flavor. Her first year on the series was spent establishing the Swamp Thing family unit, while Swamp Thing occasionally took care of threats in the immediate area. However, at the beginning of Collins' second year, she was asked by editorial to change things up. Swamp Thing hanging out with his family in a swamp was quickly becoming tiresome, so Collins was asked to break up the marriage between Swamp Thing and Abby, and then get the character to a place where he was on his own once again. Killing both Abby and Tefe was suggested as an option. But Collins, who had put a lot of work into both characters, decided she was not going to kill the two most significant female characters in the series. Instead, Collins introduced Lady Jane, an elemental assigned to care for Tefe, and she introduced a completely forgettable human male, Don Reynard. Both characters were temptations for both Swamp Thing and Abby, respectively. What followed was a slightly predictable melodrama between Swamp Thing and Abby that, quite honestly, felt more than a little forced. However, by the time Cullen had completed her second and final year, Swamp Thing and Abby went their separate ways, and Tefe was taken by Lady Jane to be raised by the Parliament of Trees. Swamp Thing was once again on his own. During her time on the title, Collins re-established the Sunderland Corporation, now controlled by the daughter, Connie Sunderland. She also brought back Anton Arcane. Both subplots collide, merge together, and eventually present a reasonable challenge to Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing also got an updated, early 90s grunge look. Thankfully, this attempt to appeal to disgruntled teen spirits didn't last long. For the most part, Collins' run on the title was not outstanding, but it was solid. It was respectful to the character and cohesive overall. Collins found a niche to explore, and the title comfortably stayed there. This approach was successful, and the sales did increase for Swamp Thing, which saved it from cancellation. Until next time.